Hello, folks. Welcome to Huber and Friends. And we'll skip the intros because he is a busy, busy man. I think he's getting on a plane very soon to head out to check in with the All-Star game and all the draft coverage for Sirius XM, MLB, and Network Radio. I don't think I got the title right on that. Someone's going to fire me for that. But it's Grant Paulsen, everybody's favorite radio host. Grant, thanks for taking time to be on this first inaugural edition of Huber and Friends.
Fired up. Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate you. And you got it right. MLB Network Radio, you crushed it.
Well,
You're one for one.
I think I said Sirius XM. You're supposed to say it afterwards or something. I don't know. Update anchors, we get kind of anal about that, so you gotta make sure you do it right. But I like to start, or I've decided I want to start this thing with a question I'm sure is going to kill my ego, but it's a good way to start it. Do you remember how we met?
I certainly remember the first couple interactions I think I had with you. So even before we were calling games, you were at Wage Radio in Leesburg, and I think there was like a day at training camp where I got to know one of your colleagues or buddies, Bruce Bornarth.
Yep.
And Brucey brought me in over at Wage Radio. It was like, 2-a-day practice or something. I'm up there, and I would have been, shoot, man. I was definitely a teenager. I don't know. I think I had my driver's license probably, but I think I followed Bruce over to this small radio station, which you would be able to tell people more about Wage than I was, but I didn't know anything about it. It was just a little station. And I still remember walking in and you guys were doing what was like an afternoon drive. It was you, Bruce Bornarth. Was Andy Hayes involved in that? Probably.
He probably was.
Yeah.
Mitch Rogers, I think, might have been in that too. He was Andy's assistant, kind of did a
Yeah,
lot of that
I
stuff.
remember Mitch. Yeah. So I went in. We talked shop on the then Redskins for a little while and kicked it with you guys. And yeah, that would have been, I want to say I was probably in upper high school, maybe young college, but probably even high school. Because within the next couple years after that, I came up here. And one of the things I've always wanted to do and taken very seriously is play by play. And that's when we really linked up, I think, for the first time and got to know each other a lot was for the Game Day Radio Network, you and I calling games.
See, I don't think we ever called games together, but I do remember you coming in. I know Bruce was the connection, but I remember you did a lot of work for Andy Hayes, which I didn't do as much, so that might be the reason. But again, it was always, and I remember Bruce just kind of talking about you and oh, this young guy, he's really great at everything, and so it was always kind of great to meet you, and I was always impressed. And kind of let's go back a little bit. You've kind of got, I think, what we would call an unconventional in the business. You know, they talk about Nepo babies. Maybe you're a Nepo nephew. I think that's how your connection came. Can you tell folks about how you started in the business or kind of got your foot in the door?
Yeah. So way back when, when I was, I think about 9 years old, um, so my uncle forever and ever was a disc jockey and a radio personality in Pittsburgh. He was a morning show host for people that weren't in the Pittsburgh area or didn't know Scott Paulsen on WDVE 102.5. He was, a lot of people listening, I'm sure, in the DC area, like an Elliot in the morning. I would say, because of the market in Pittsburgh and there aren't nearly as many stations or options. He was like a bigger star, frankly. I mean, everywhere we went when I would go out with him to dinner, go out to eat or just go somewhere when I was a kid, people would be stopping him and saying hello. And I always thought it was the coolest thing in the world. But anyway, we would always argue about sports and debate sports. He was not a sports radio guy by any means, but he was a sports fan who did, like I said, they played music. They did a lot of comedy bits. He was a musician. So not in the same exact realm that I'm in, but a radio guy. And long story short, we were at a family picnic in the summer of 1998, I would guess. And at that time, the Redskins and the Steelers would play in this scrimmage, not even a preseason game. But now you see it all the time where these teams have these practices with each other. But it was an actual scrimmage. Like they had a scoreboard and a bug on the TV. Like I loved it, right?
Channel 5, right?
Exactly. So it was like my favorite thing. And the Redskins had just beaten the Steelers in this thing like 14-7 or whatever. And I was talking trash and we were talking about the teams and I was going in on the Steelers. And I think because I was like 9 and now that I'm a grown up, I can kind of understand it better. He was not only taken aback by like how much I knew all the players and the stats and was obsessed with it, but also everything that he did in his life and thought about was probably is this a radio bit? Because
Yep.
that's how I live my life now as
Sure.
a afternoon drive radio host. So, and he's got the light bulb going off. So he brought me on to basically have this argument on his radio show, but he turned it into a fun thing where he called me his like sports bookie. And so it turned into me doing football picks on his radio show as his sports bookie when I was 10 years old. And I would give him the betting lines and tell him who to bet on. And now remember, at that time, there's no FanDuel, like there's no betting. Everything is under the table and it's very like hush hush. So it's just kind of a really funny thing that your bookie would be this kid. And I should point out that it was my grandmother who passed away, a year or two before that, who used to do his football picks, who knew nothing about football. So he would have her on to pick football games, and like she would just, she liked the Giants a little bit, but she didn't know anything about football. So like I just kind of like slid into that spot almost on his show as his like comedy football picker. Local newspaper in my hometown of King George County, Virginia, very small county, one high school town, does a story about it. Then Channel 9 in Washington sees that and does a story about the fact that I'm doing these football picks. And the King George Journal, this weekly paper, asked me to write like a weekly little 100-word column on DC sports. So now Channel 9, it does this thing where they're, again, all of this is so silly to look back on, but they're like, move over, Kornheiser and Wilbon. Here's a 10-year-old who, wrote 50 words. And so then Channel 9, after doing this story, has me up every Friday to do football picks. And so all of this happens within about a year when I'm 10. And because Channel 9 is a WUSA TV 9 affiliate, eventually somebody at Letterman sees this as they're kind of, scrolling for guest ideas, I suppose. And that was kind of the big break when I was 11, is that, a year and a half or so after that original conversation, Letterman has me on to do a same kind of deal. It's always like, let's just ask this kid questions and we'll all laugh that he talks fast and answers them or whatever. And eventually you're not the cute kid anymore and you grow some facial hair and it's not as fun to watch you talk about sports. But that was kind of how it all happened. I ended up going on the Letterman show. I was really, really lucky to do that. He took a liking to me 6 different times over like 7 years. I went up there 7 times in 7 years. And yeah, that was kind of how it all got started and how I figured out this is what I wanted to do forever. Even when the valve turned off, so to speak, Jeremy, I wanted to be in this business.
Yeah, and there's a picture of you and Dave, and I actually had a chance to go back and watch those, and it was just amazing, the Super Bowl one you did. But I wanted to ask, when all that's happening, are you kind of processing this, how much you're doing, or is it just kind of, hey, this is a fun thing, let me go do this?
The second one, I had no idea. Like the best way to answer that is probably via the lens of the Letterman show. I didn't really know the importance of or how big of a deal that was. Like, I would be way more nervous today, probably being asked to go on Fallon or a show than I was then. I didn't know who David Letterman was
Yeah.
necessarily the first time. Like, I knew that my parents watched his show at night, but you don't really have any kind of a scope of national television and what's at stake. And if you say something stupid, what happens? I just, none of that really resonated. I knew it was cool that I was getting to do fun things. And I was grateful for that. I mean, as a sports fan, like the fact that I was in the Wizards locker room interviewing Juwan Howard or going to training camp on Channel 9's dime and staying, with my mom normally who traveled with me or whatever, at a hotel for a few days and being at camp practices on the sideline when I would have to be behind the rope
Mhm.
before that. Like I knew everything was awesome, but no, I had no idea like the magnitude of some of these things. Even now looking back, like Real Sports with Brian Gumble sending James Brown to my house or whatever it was, I was like, oh, this is fun. Like this is really cool. I know James Brown. He's one of my heroes. Now you look back and you're like, man, this was some really huge stuff, because I also think like you see a lot more of this now, and I'm always personally interested when I see the young kid sports reporter or whatever. But in this era where with YouTube, everyone's got their own channel and like all of this stuff is way more ubiquitous.
Mhm.
I'm sure there were people. You'd be surprised how many people in the business I've talked to, like John Clayton, the late great ESPN insider, and others that said, I was like you. I started writing when I was really young. But I think at that time, with whatever era of media that was, like there wasn't a lot of that. And so that's why it was kind of interesting. And it is a little bit more prevalent now, I'd say.
Grant, back to the Letterman stuff, and I think I found the answer online, but I was really kind of consumed by it for a second. I was a fan of the Little Rascals, and I'd read up on Hal Roach, and he had said that, little kids don't act. They kind of, you feed them an idea and they go. The Letterman stuff you did, was that all scripted? Was that some of a, hey, we want you to do this, and they kind of let you go? How did that all work?
So everything on set where David Letterman and I are talking is completely spontaneous and off the cuff, right? The way that worked is generally while you're on your way there, if you train up literally on the train and or while you're sitting in the gate before a flight, the day of the show, like in the morning, a producer will call you
Mm-hmm.
and they want to go over things you've done recently in your life. And they do the same thing with the actors and actresses you're watching because they're looking for like a couple of little stories that he can tee you up on with that blue card.
Yep.
Now, what's funny is, and I've found this out more as time's gone on, he was notorious for not talking about one thing on that blue card. Like, I don't think a single thing that they ever said, "Oh, he'll definitely bring this up," did he ever bring up. I generally knew why I was getting called up there, though. Two reasons. Number one, I was a fill-in essentially, so I
Mm-hmm.
turned into a guy that like we never had more than maybe 48 hours notice. A lot of times it was 24 hours. There was a time when they called my house in the summer. I was home from school because there's no school in the summer at 11 a.m. And they said, "Can you be on a flight in an hour and a half at a national?" And we don't live an hour and a half away from
Yeah.
national.
Yeah.
But they tape at 5:30. I mean, but like someone had canceled and they got 7 minutes and do you want to be up here kind of thing. But normally they would say like, "Hey, the NCAA tournament's going on. Dave wants to know what your bracket looks like." Or I remember one time, uh, must have been the early 2000s, like Barry Bonds was having some ridiculous month. And frankly, I'm sure it was during the year where he was catching McGuire and Sosa and breaking the home run record. And he wanted to talk about Barry Bonds. So I always kind of knew what the premise was. But that's the answer for at the desk was you never knew where he was going. The other thing about Letterman, which is unique apparently, I never did the other ones. Like Leno called after I went on Letterman the first time, but the Letterman show asked, they said, if you wouldn't mind, would you, like if we have him on, if Leno calls, essentially, like we'd like to, we'll have him back, but we'd like him to make him our little sports kid.
Sure.
And so I think my father, just out of like loyalty, was like, "Oh, we're not going to go out to LA." But what's funny is I'm pretty sure, I don't know if my parents would admit it now. I think they were more Leno guys until Letterman had me on than Letterman. But we ended up being a big Letterman family, clearly. Um, but then to answer your question, the time that they fed me stuff, the only time that ever happened was at the Super Bowl.
Yep.
So the comedy bits in that routine that I did, or it wasn't really a routine, but they put together like a what was originally like an 8-minute piece that gets whittled down to 4 for TV or whatever, of
Sure.
just a bunch of bits and gags from the week. And it was things like having a bunch of players see how many times they could say Paul Tagliabue's
Yep.
name in 10 seconds. And then it ends, the payoff is Paul Tagliabue doing it. Or, there's a great joke where I'm asking Steve Young, like, what's the most important thing to do? And then what's the second most important? And then they cut away and it's like, what's the 13th most important? And he's like, have a good breakfast, man. My favorite joke in all of that was I'm up on stage with Franco Harris and Joe Montana. And just saying this is still like pinch me cool, right? But I'm on stage with those two guys, and we had so much access because CBS had the rights to the Super Bowl that year.
Yep.
Or else a lot of this we couldn't have called our shots. But I mean, you wouldn't believe when you're with the Letterman show and it's the network doing TV. Like there was, if presidents were sitting at a table having a meal, we could have walked in and just asked them for their cookies. Like it was crazy. But I went up on stage with Montana and Franco right after they'd done this event, and the bit was, and we never like prepped these guys beforehand, so I
Yep.
always felt terrible about it because I'm coming off as just this jackass little
Yeah.
kid,
Yeah.
and I couldn't have been less like a jerk. I mean, I was so happy to meet these people I can't describe. So anyway, so I say to him, I say, how about an autograph? And Joe Montana's like, oh, of course. Frank Harris is like, no problem. And then I whip out a little steno pad notebook out of my back pocket and say, who do I make it out to? It's like all those little jokes were written. They sent me a little packet, but they would not necessarily go over the delivery, but they would just say, all right, here, Jerry Rice, is over here. We're gonna go do this thing with Jerry. We're gonna do the Super Bowl one. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, here we go. And they like point to it. They're like, okay, he's gonna let you try on his ring, ask him to try on his ring, and then ask him why there's two P's in Super Bowl. And like his ring had always been spelled wrong or something. Now that one actually didn't even make the video. Like you've never seen that. But like that was kind of the gist was, we're going to this event with Joe Namath, ask him about this. It's funny to say this now, but some of the stuff I didn't even get. I didn't understand.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the joke was. Like Miss America was there. I understand the humor in me standing there as a little kid interviewing Miss America, but we went up to this gorgeous woman who I don't even know which name or which Miss America it was. But I'm standing there and they told me to ask Miss America, what's Donald Trump like?
I saw that.
Yeah. Now, again, this is in
Yes.
2001 or whatever. Like, so it's 23 years later. It's funnier, but like at that time, I think there was a controversy with, weirdly, I know,
Yeah.
with Trump and whatever was going on. But I had no idea what that meant. I'm just like, and she's like, oh, I've never met Donald. And it's like, there's just so many things like that. So a long-winded way of answering the question, and I haven't thought about it in a long time, but it's kind of fun to think about and talk about. That was the time where it was me walking around. I think my mom was on that trip, not my dad, because my dad was, full time. My mom was a teacher, had summers off,
Mhm.
and had some more flexibility. And it was like us and they sent around. It was like an audio guy, a camera guy, and like two joke writers were with us everywhere.
Yeah.
So
God.
it was a total of our traveling party was like 6 or 7, and there were two joke writers. It was basically the Biff Henderson thing, if you're familiar with the show, and they had me filling in for Biff that year.
Awesome. Grant, I've read up on some of your stuff, and you kind of talk about how after that, I think the next year you were with ABC covering the Super Bowl. You did some Little League World Series with them, and then stuff starts to dry up a little bit. And it's the whole way. I think I don't know right the saying was, but precociousness doesn't last. It kind of gets old quickly. So you get to this point where some of those opportunities are drying up. When you were that young, what were you thinking of doing, and how were you kind of processing keeping your toe in the water?
Yeah, so for me, I think what happened really starting in maybe middle school, there was less of like the novelty. It started to wear off of like, oh, this is a cute kid. Now, a lot of the relationships that I had with these places continued. So like some of the grandfathered in stuff, like Letterman still had me on 1 or 2 more times. The Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel piece, which I've cited a couple times because that was huge, I think, for me. And kind of each one of these kind of gave me a little more life, if you will, and kind
Yep.
of pushed me forward. That was my freshman year of high school. And I only remember that because I was like a week or so into high school. And you kind of just want to blend in a little bit. Like you're a freshman,
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
you're not trying to like, step on any senior toes or anything. And then the HBO cameras are like following me around to my classrooms and, which you got a little bit of attention from some people that you wanted some attention from, I guess. So it wasn't terrible. But yeah, so that was freshman year of high school. But you're right. Like within the next year or two, as I said, kind of the valve turns off. The cute novelty act goes away because it's the same to me. The way I describe it to people is when you watch these shows now and they have a fast talking smart kid on that knows all of the presidents in their history, or like that knows every bone. Like there was like a little girl on Ellen that knew every bone or whatever. Like that's amazing because she's really young and cute,
Yep.
and I wasn't anymore. So I just knew I've now I comp it to like I was at the water fountain and I got pulled away and I'm
Mhm.
thirsty. I wanted to go to Super Bowls. If you get to do something, like there's always that question of like, my co-host in DC in the radio, Danny and I argue about like who's got it worse rooting for Washington football? A guy who's seen a parade and knows what it felt like, or a guy who never has? And I argue that's the person that's been there and knows how good it can be because you know what you're missing. Like I've never smoked a cigarette in my life for a reason. I don't want to know what that
Hmm.
feeling of, and so I knew I got to get back to a Super Bowl. I want to be the guy on the stage interviewing those players. Like I want that juice, or just I want to be covering something. So what I did basically was I said, okay, this is my goal. And I just kind of I kept my fingers in as many pies as possible. I continued to write in way more anonymity than before. Like I was no longer doing SI for kids previews or, writing for NFL.com or whoever had asked me to do things. But I was now writing for the Freelance Star in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I was going to, I had a deadline every Friday and I was going to turn in a good story, I thought, every Friday. Right. I decided with college, I had options and could have gone to other places. I said, you know what? I'm going to stay as close as possible to DC so that I can continue to hit up the producers I know at Channel 9 and Channel 5 and whatever. And occasionally they might have me back on to break a game down, or they might be in a pinch and, whatever. So I went to George Mason right here in Fairfax rather than going to Virginia Tech where all my buddies went or whatever,
Mhm.
and kind of being out of sight, out of mind. And that was kind of the philosophy. I got a gig through all of this very early on at SiriusXM. SiriusXM launched in like 2001. They pushed back their launch after September 11th, so it was like that era. And they hired me originally to do a show on a teen talk channel. When that channel disbanded, they moved me to a kids talk channel, like XM Kids, and I just did
Mhm.
a sports talk show on a kids station. Well, I kept doing XM shows all throughout. I never stopped. I still today, as you said, work at Sirius XM on different channels. But like eventually I transitioned in high school to their baseball channel, which they had in house. And that was my first opportunity to get off of kind of an age oriented platform. And even though I was the youngest person on the channel by a good ways, like do an actual baseball show, right?
Yep.
So that was the goal, was like, if I have a gig, I'm keeping it until they kick me out the door, and I'm just going to keep honing the craft and keep working at it. So I kept writing. So in college, I am writing, I'm doing Sirius XM. It's, again, there's nothing really overly sexy about any of it. But I knew that if I kept kind of chopping wood in that way, I'd be well positioned. And then 2.0, like if you want to call it that, of like actually getting some cool opportunities again, started with just trying to get my foot in the door when the local FM sports talk station in DC, flipped to sports from Guy Talk,
Yep.
and, was able to basically be the equivalent of like a paid intern, but like an assistant to a reporter for a year.
Talking about that, I feel like we talked at some point during that, and I feel like you may have kind of in your mind got a little passed over for maybe a skins beat reporter job, and you're upset about it, I think. I may be misremembering that, but how did you kind of take that disappointment and kind of maybe cool your heels to wait until you got the job that you wanted, eventually becoming the beat reporter, which really opened doors for you?
Yeah, so I think you're remembering some things correctly. I would never say, I would not say that I was passed over, because I didn't think I was going to get the beat reporter job. I was still in college. What I will say is, and I think this is what you're remembering, I had a hell of a hard time just getting in and getting a callback at that station,
Okay.
which is looking back, I mean, not a knock, right? But I was young and I was in school. And if you're a program director, and the program director at the time is still the guy there
Yeah.
now, who's given me essentially my entire career in terms of, terrestrial radio on air, Chris Kynard, who is not only the best boss I've had, but just like, a mentor in so many ways.
And
But
folks, he's not making that up. He really is. This is the guy that kind of took on the Dan Snyder machine and won. So he's a great guy and a great boss.
yeah, he's done a really good job, right? But um yeah, so what you're remembering correctly is, and I've joked with him about this. I mean, now he's filling out a lineup and has like real big boss problems, but I mean, I reached out so many times because they were going sports. And he's probably filing me in a folder of like, in 2 years, like maybe this is someone to talk to. And I had known him very little, like not well. We were Facebook friends, but he was the producer for the Junkies. They'd had me on a couple times for the same stuff, for the kid stuff, right?
Yep.
In the past, like everybody else, or they'd had me on a post game show here or there or whatever. So like he knew of me, but I'm sure kind of viewed me through the same lens as most people did, of like, okay, this guy, whatever. But what happened was, and this is where our buddy, our mutual friend Chris Russell, he gets a lot of credit here. So Russell got the job as the beat reporter. I was good friends with Chris because he worked at Sirius XM with me,
Hmm.
and I still remember we went to McDonald's on New York Avenue and had breakfast one morning. And he told me he got the beat reporter job for this station that had just launched in 2009. And he was going to be starting at training camp within a week or two. But he was drinking through a fire hose. Number one, he'd never really been around the team at all.
Mhm.
He didn't know any, he knew the players' names, but he didn't know anybody there. And I had been around the Redskins for years and years and years. I mean, I had been at every home game basically since 99 in a media capacity. I knew a lot of the players personally at that point. I knew some of the front office people personally. And so I told him, I said, look, I got numbers, I got some contacts. Let me help you basically as a reporter. Get me in there, meaning it, at the Fan, talk to Chris Kinard, and I'll come out and hold a mic and just get audio for you. And I don't have to, I won't step on your toes. I don't have to do anything on air, but just let me, get me in to do whatever. Because at that point in time, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and act like I was digging ditches. Like, I've never worked. I mean, this is all fun,
Yeah.
right? Pete's working for a living. But like, I think a lot of people assume things sometimes when they find out, oh, your uncle was in the business or whatever. Like, I was running the board at Sirius XM for a while. You know what I mean? Like for
Yeah.
Earl Forsey, one of our great buddies doing a
Yeah.
college football show. I volunteered to do that to make some money. Like, there were so many times where I would do a late night show that went till 2 in the morning, and then I was back on at 8 a.m. So I would sleep literally on the floor at
Yep.
Sirius XM. Now,
Been
again,
there.
I'm not sitting here trying to get like some ribbon for that. My point is just like there's a hustle that is necessary and a grind that if you care about this thing, you got to have. And so my point to Chris was just get me in there and I'll figure the rest out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if I got to run the board, if I got to go in on first thing in the morning on weekends, like, so he did. And he brought me in as his assistant for that first year. And frankly, if Chris stayed at the Fan, who knows if I ever get a beat reporter job.
Uh-huh.
But I still joke with him to this day. 980, the other DC sports station, comes to him a couple days before the training camp 1 year later and offers him a contract, and he goes and does that. And he leaves the aforementioned Chris Kinard and the radio station, the Fan, in a lurch. And so now they're looking for a beat reporter. I was his assistant, and over the course of the year, ended up being on air a bunch because Chris this day was doing this, or they'd send him here, and I would cover the other thing. And so I was kind of like, I don't want to say a 1B reporter, but my role was larger than I had anticipated,
Yep.
right? And so by that point, I think, CK was kind of thinking, okay, this guy's young. We're developing him. We're investing resources. And he did, I'm sure, some kind of a thorough search. And I got the job to replace the guy that I was assisting. And so that was 2010, year one of the Mike Shanahan era. So I covered the beat from 2010 to 2013, 4 seasons, the entire Shanahan era. That's Robert Griffin, the beginning of Cousins, all that stuff, which was an incredible time to be around the team. And then at the end of the 13 season is when I transitioned into a midday show with Danny Rouillet, Grant and Danny, which was from 10 to 2. That was January of 2014. And we did that for, 8 years or whatever until we moved to afternoon drive during the pandemic now, however, 3 years ago or whatever that was.
Sure. Grant, one of the things that I kind of think about, I want to get into your relationship and your working with Danny because I think it's really good and how the work you guys have done. But I always say there's a fearlessness to you, which I don't kind of get from looking at you, but you kind of see it in the stuff you've done when you were a little kid, just walking up to these guys and asking them the absurd questions you're doing for Letterman, but also all the contacts you built. And it's a quick story I want to tell. I had a birthday party about 10 years ago and you came, and I want to thank you. You closed down the bar with me, though. Again,
Yes,
you
sir.
were
That was a good night.
you were much more sober than I was at the time. But I remember a friend of mine, good friend of mine, I kind of threw this idea out to you that she had in high school been in a fight in front of a frozen yogurt shop. And you go in and I'm like, this kid's the next Stern, because it's just another thing that you're kind of opening up another layer. And I'm like, why is she telling him this? This is just some random guy that is on the radio, but it was great. But again, where do you think the fearlessness comes from in this line of work for you, maybe in life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a couple of things. I have no problem with uncomfortable interactions. I think that is an important trait. But it's I've never thought of it as something that maybe everyone doesn't have, but it is something Danny comments on all the time. Like, I don't now I won't say this is the case in every regard. I'm the
Yep.
kind of guy, I was not going to propose if I didn't know my wife was going to say yes.
Yep.
I didn't ever ask a girl to prom who said no, not because girls wouldn't have said no. It's because I had to know you were going to say yes. Like that fear of rejection was real for your boy. But I don't really have that in sports. If I know Jason Worth, to give you an example, hates my radio station and is prickly and doesn't want to deal with me, I got no problem walking up to his locker and saying, "Hey, you got 2 minutes," and letting him tell me to go away.
Sure.
Right. And like, why is that? I don't know. I just think, I don't want to say I enjoy those interactions, but I am not bothered by them. And I also, when you're talking about that very fun night that we shared, which was a good time, we need to have more of those. But like that to me, that whatever that is, I love. I'm a question asker. Like my wife calls it curious. She thinks
Mhm.
I'm curious. Again, it annoys her to no end, by the way. Um,
Also, you're
but like
tweeting.
exactly. Well, I've never sat in an Uber and like by the end of the ride gotten out and not known the driver decently. Now,
Yep.
sometimes they don't want to play ball and that's fine. And to a lot of people, that's like the worst thing they could ever hear. But I don't know. That's just my demeanor. I don't know why or where, but I like talking to people and I think it has served me very well, to your point, because this is a relationships business. It's a networking business. And I like kind of finding ways to relate to people. And yeah, I like that part of it a lot. Just the communication of kind of keeping in touch. And I think that takes a lot of work too. This is kind of another discussion, but I take pride in the fact that I think most of the people that I covered, certainly on the beat, would tell you like I wasn't just hitting them up to figure out if they were playing on Sunday, right? Like
Yep.
I had a rapport with them that was more than just, "Hey, I need you for this." Um, I was always I thought it was important you don't become friends with people, whatever, in that sense. I'm not going out and having drinks or getting dinner with for like access, but I just think checking in on people, hitting them up when something good or bad happens, like that kind of stuff is really important. Not because you need them strategically, although I guess that is the ultimate like side effect, but just being a person, and like, I don't know if that relates in any way, but from a sports standpoint, I would say that's, you got to work at that. Like young people that are listening or whatever that want to get into this business, it's about people. The players on TV are just guys and girls that they're just normal people. And the people that they really appreciate, what I found is people who treat them like they're normal, not like they're stars. They don't want to be a star when they come off the floor. They just want you to talk to them like you talk to all your other friends.
Grant, you and your partner Danny Rouye, who you mentioned, aren't stars in the DC area at this point. The show, the drive time show, kind of, I think, maybe the preeminent late afternoon, the afternoon show when it comes to sports in DC. One thing I wanted to kind of bring up with Danny, I remember when he was on with his previous host, and I didn't really like the show all that much. And I thought when you guys came together, the chemistry was almost immediate. I'm sure in your eyes it wasn't, but were there things when you kind of were told, hey, you're going to work with this guy, Danny? Did you kind of see like all the extreme talent that he kind of had, plus the D1 athlete background, and go, something really special can be made here?
Yeah, so we were lucky because we were buddies kind of already and hit it off air. Um, he came into the radio station about when I did, that same first year of the Fan, and he was in a way different capacity. He was kind of doing some night stuff initially. Then him and Holden Kushner, who was his co-host at night, ended up getting the midday show. So he was on like a different track of hosting, and I was kind of in the field reporting. I thought it would be cool because we're very, very different in how we view sports and care about sports. He is an extremely reactionary fan. He is he's a guy that's gonna scream and yell and want people fired and whatever. And like, I think you need that. Two people like me who are a little more, I don't want to say reporter background, but he jokingly calls me press box Paulsen, right? Like sitting there doesn't relate or play as well, probably, because the average person listening is not me, it's him in a sense. So you need that. So I thought that juxtaposition would play really, really well. I knew just because we were very friendly, we liked a lot of the same. I mean, we would get together and go out and get barbecue from time to time just to kick it or whatever. Like, I knew we'd have a good relationship. But what you said is true. Like, to me, I knew he was ultra talented, but he knows sports. Like, he's a really, really funny guy. And we always still, even as we sit here today, a decade into our show, like, need to better tap into some of his impressions and some of the stuff he does, and just do more of those comedy bits that can differentiate our show, because most people don't have someone who can do some of the stuff he can do. But like, I don't think gets enough credit for, like, he knows sports, and like, could just do a straight man sports show where he never does an impression or does any comedy. So like, I knew he was going to be really good at it. I didn't know as a show, like, how I knew. My thing is, I've never really thought about like the failing part of it. I'm just all in and we'll see where it goes. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of my mindset, is like, we're doing a show and there's no way that we're going to be not doing a show in a year. I viewed it, I got advice from my uncle who we talked about, and then I read a lot about this via, oddly enough, Colin Cowherd, like building a radio show as almost like a Christmas tree, where just get the tree up. Like, don't worry about the lights and the ornaments yet. Put the tree up and pull out the branches. That's the first thing. So let's just do a good radio show. Let's worry about breaking down the games. Let's watch the games, which people don't do enough of in our industry. Let's have opinions, which a lot of people don't, with that are actually backed by fact. And like, let's just do a radio show, and then we'll add bells and whistles. Like, let's throw lights on it. Let's throw ornaments on it. Let's get the tinsel. Is that what it's called? I don't even remember.
Yes.
Thank you. You got me. But like, we'll add the bit after that, or what if we tweak this? But like, that was kind of the goal. And I think pretty quickly I had a good feel for, okay, like, this is going well. We got a shot to do this at a high level, because I thought it was a nice combination of nuts and bolts sports. Like, I would take our game breakdowns and, sports analysis right there with anything in the city right away. And I was like, but we both have like a really good personality part of it too, where we can kind of chop it up about food for 20 minutes and, get back to sports after that. I think that is a good tandem, I would say.
I think I've taken you way over the time, but I think I got two more questions if you got time for them, Grant, as I wanted to ask you. You do so many things. Again, you're a radio host. You do things for Monumental Sports Network. You also have, you do post game for the Nationals. And I wondered, when you kind of look at this with all the things you do, are there ever times you feel like you have to choose your words carefully because you're covering teams? You're not just the straight, hey, I'm doing this sports show, like maybe where it was 50 years ago, where you could say, hey, I'm just beholden to my radio station. How does that ever come up in your mind? How do you deal with that?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Every day, I would say. I mean, I don't think that's the same, though, as like pulling punches, in the sense of, I think what you said's perfect. Like, using my words carefully. I listen to people on the air and I cringe with some of the things they say and how they talk about players or coaches or whatever. One thing I'll never do, you'll just never hear, is I'll never call for somebody's job. I might make it clear that I don't think they're good at their job and that they should be fired, but you'll never hear me say this guy should be fired, or something like that. I promise. That's number one. Number two, it's interesting as I think about this. Like, there are times I think it's like time and place, maybe, where I run a little more hot or fan reactionary, like on social media or on Twitter, just because I'm watching a game and I'm like, oh my God, he blew another game, this guy. But what I try to do, and I'm not perfect at this, I'm sure, is, I don't even remember who told me this, but it's some of the best advice I ever got. Don't talk about the person, talk about the performance. You don't say he stinks. He played a bad game. It doesn't sound like a big difference. It's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And especially if you're the player or the coach, because these guys listen, right? But, he's not dumb. He made a dumb play.
Yep.
That's one thing I try to do differently, I think, than maybe other people. The other thing is, I go to the locker rooms. I go to the games, as you said. I take pride in this fact. Less so than I used to be able to now in afternoons with Washington's football operation, unfortunately. But I'm hoping to be at training camp a bunch, and hopefully, I've been at most home games for the last 20 years. I'm around because I like the idea. And whenever I meet someone, I tell them this. I say, hey, here's my information. Here's my number, whether it's GM of a Will Dawkins or whoever. If you hear something you don't like, please reach out to me and I'm happy to talk about it. Like, because there's a fine line between when I was on the beat, the PR director's name was Tony Wiley with the Redskins at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt like if Tony's not a little bit pissed at me, I'm not doing a good job. Like, we butted heads constantly. We have an unbelievably good relationship now, I would say. But like the amount of times he yelled at me or we were kind of at odds over something, I mean, it was weekly. But his job and my job are kind of in opposition in a sense.
Yep.
So if I'm just never being talked to or walking that line or never annoying the team, then I'm probably out of sight, out of mind, and not a very good reporter in a sense. So like there's a little bit of, I don't mind someone being upset with me. I've got to have opinions. To use another Colin Cowherd line, I write 50 columns a day, like all day long. We're sitting here giving opinions very publicly. But the answer is yes, because it's not like a trade for people liking you. It's important to me that I am respected. And what I have learned is that people that are working for the teams, they'll respect you still, even if you're negative when it's warranted, but not if you're a jerk. And so I don't ever really want to come off as a jerk. You don't always succeed at that or excel at that. And there have been times where I've said, you're right, I went too far. I apologize. Like, that has happened, certainly. And I've learned that lesson, and I'm not going to bat 1,000 moving forward. But like, that is how I would describe it, Jeremy, is that most people in my job love the comfort of the studio and you can lob bombs. And I'm not knocking anyone. Like, they're probably more entertaining. They're probably, certainly more opinionated at times. I think you can do a really good job of being truthful and honest and analytical, and also be just a little more professional to the point where maybe you're respected and not disliked always.
Grant, we'll wrap it up with this. I know one of things you've always said is your ultimate job is to be a play-by-play broadcaster. I know you did I believe you did the XFL with the Defenders for a year before that kind of changed around. I know you also surprisingly did color on some Nationals broadcast, which I remember we talked about. Even you were a little bit shocked by how that all played out. And there's a lot of ways for people can kind of see your thoughts on how that all worked out and how great of an experience it was. But is that still the dream? And how do you move forward as a guy who, you're a married man with 3 kids, all of them very, very young children. How have you tried to kind of keep moving toward that goal? Because we all know if you don't kind of keep moving to your goals, it really can kind of do a number on you. How have you tried to keep moving toward that?
Yeah, you're kind of speaking my language. This is something that think it's like you're in my head that I think about all the time. The answer is I don't have a good answer right now. I mean, I am in a weird spot from the play-by-play dream standpoint because, what I would have to do to probably get where I want to go at this point would be to take a step back from the stuff that I do every day and, go call games like minor league baseball to start or something like that. And work my way up, or just go do play-by-play full time or something. I can't do that. Like, there's no way to, number one, make the money that I'm making if I'm leveling with you, doing it that way. But also, it's not practical. I also, as you said, I don't really want to leave the market. My wife's from here. I'm from here. Our kids are here. So that kind of boxes you in even a little bit more. For me, I keep chopping wood locally and hope that those opportunities present themselves. You mentioned the XFL. That was some of the most fun I've ever had. It really was. Like, do I want to eventually be calling a network games on Westwood One? Yeah, that's the ultimate dream. But sitting next to Logan Paulsen calling the Defenders on a Saturday was a lot of fun too. Obviously, they haven't had a radio home the last couple of years, and the league hasn't really done that. But like, that would be a dream to get to do that again at this point. And I think those experiences are great. Having the 2 Nationals games it made me feel like, okay, you're in the conversation, like you're in the mix, in that situation where, if something pops up occasionally and one of these teams needs a fill-in for a day, like your name comes up when people are talking. Like, that feels good. I was one of the finalists for the Commander's job. when that play-by-play job came up and Bram Weinstein got it. And I was having dinners with and sitting down with Julie Donaldson and D'Angelo Hall and people with the team. And again, while it's heartbreaking when you don't get a gig like that, that's probably the dream job more than anything in the history of my life. There have been more popes while I've been alive than play-by-play people for that team. Like, that was an honor to be in that mix and to be involved with that. So it gives you an idea that, like, at least in my own market, you're in the mix, which is all you can ask for certain things. But yeah, I think about this a lot. I mean, if I had to guess, like, the next play, as we get a little more settled in with our kids getting a little older, maybe you have someone working on your behalf who just tries to go get you a gig or two, where you could travel on weekends and call games on one of the 9,000 networks and just do it that way. But there's no doubt, that as I've gotten older, that is still my dream. That is still my priority. I still want to work toward that. It gets a little more complicated.
Yep.
It's certainly, like, there's just no way around that. Um, and I'm very happy with what I'm doing. Like, it's okay sometimes to maybe mindfully or eye something in the refrigerator while you sit there and you're eating what you're eating. But if I'm doing what I'm doing right now in several years, I'd be thrilled. But yeah, I'd love to mix in a little more play-by-play. That is the most fun that I have for sure.
Well, I know I had you do a Georgetown baseball game for me a couple
Yeah,
years
you hooked
ago,
me up with, yeah, that's
and
been awesome.
you were amazing as always.
I
Grant, you're so
appreciate it.
generous with your time, and again, so much just good wishes to you. Thanks again for being our inaugural guest here on Huber and Friends. Thank you so much, man.
Dude, yeah, absolutely. It seriously means a lot. You asked me to do number one, and I'm excited to listen as you go forward here. This is a cool concept. Appreciate you as always, Jeremy.
Thanks, Grant.